There is an unresolved problem in identity politics that I'm sure you're all familiar with. We can talk about what we share as human beings in idealist terms, and by doing so, we run the risk of ignoring the fact that we are all individuals who inhabit individual bodies with individual histories. And we all know how important it is to take account of individual histories and the bodies that people inhabit, because if we don't do that, then we're not going to understand the basis of injustice in our society. You can also talk about individuals purely in terms of their bodies and their bodily histories and what possible physical groupings they belong to, where their affinities and their loyalties lie. But by doing so, you run the risk of ignoring what it is that all human beings have in common. Now, Goethe wasn't interested in identity politics. There was no reason why he would have been. But he was very interested in this unresolved problem of idealistic determinations of human life and naturalistic determinations of human life. And this is one of the founding problems that he talks about in Wahlverwandtschaften. So today we're going to be looking at the conflict between the idealist and the naturalist determinations of life. We're going to be continuing with that discussion, but we're going to be bringing in the difficult question of desire and interpretation. I'm John Noyes, and I'm here to guide you through the reading of all of Goethe's novels. Today, continuing with elective affinities, desire, and interpretation. The more we look at the concept of nature in elective affinities, the more problematic it becomes, because as soon as we include human nature and human activity into the general concept of nature, then it becomes complicated. Human action and understanding is both distinct from nature, but it's also included in the concept of nature. Nature determines human life as the place of the passions, beyond the reach of reason, but it also determines human life as a phenomenon governed by freedom of reason. So where does this leave the human being in love, faced with passions, pressing them into action on the one side, and reason and the mores that reason tells them is given by society on the other hand? Now, it's interesting that Goethe wrote this problem into the central metaphor of elective affinities, and I think we saw last week how he did this. I'd like to take a short look at a notice, an advertisement that Goethe placed anonymously in a journal in 1809 when elective affinities appeared, and I'm going to read what he wrote there. It seems that the author came to this title on the basis of his continued research in the physical sciences. He may have noticed that ethical comparisons are often used in the natural sciences in order to make something that is far removed from the sphere of human existence more familiar. And so, in a case involving morality, he must have also wanted to return a chemical analogy to its conceptual origins, and all the more since there is everywhere only one nature. Furthermore, passionate necessity cuts a relentless swath through the realm of reason's spirited freedom, and this can only be completely remedied by a higher hand, though perhaps not in this life. There is so much in this short paragraph that is instructive when it comes to reading elective affinities. But let me just concentrate on a couple of things. First of all, there is everywhere only one nature. We have the chemical analogy and we have the ethical situation. You can compare the one to the other, but everywhere there is only one nature. And in human life, this one nature has these two aspects that he talks about. There is passionate necessity. Necessity means it has to be. It is a rule of nature. We may not understand it, but it is an inherent natural principle governing human life. And here Goethe is very much following in the footsteps of Leibniz. There are principles governing natural phenomena. We may not understand them, but nevertheless they are there. Then on the other hand, the realm of reason's spirited freedom. The realm of reason's spirited freedom. Spirited or happy, heiter is the word that Goethe uses, and reason can follow its own rules, so it would seem. Now this was a fundamental problem of the time. Reason and freedom on the one hand, nature and passion on the other hand, and it remained largely unresolved. And it is also unresolved in Goethe's novel, and he tells us quite clearly it may not be completely resolved in this life except by a higher hand. And we've already seen what this higher hand looks like. It's the voice of the narrator, the ironic voice of the narrator. And if we look at it from this point of view, then I think we can much better understand the slightly bizarre ending of this novel, where a higher hand has to step in and resolve the situation. If you return to the very last paragraph, the last couple of sentences in this novel, with Goethe's description in mind, then it sounds different from how it might have sounded upon first reading. So I'm just going to read it again now, this ending. So the lovers rest side by side. Peace hovers above their resting place. Smiling angels in their likeness look down at them from the vault. And what a charming moment it will be when in time to come the two awake together. So if it takes a higher hand to resolve the discrepancy between passionate necessity and spirited freedom, and if this can probably not even happen in this life, then where does this leave storytelling? What does this mean then for telling the story of a life? Whether it's Werther's life, Wilhelm Meister's life, or Eduard's life. And what Goethe seems to understand by telling the story of a life is setting up this opposition between a nature whose relentless force drives everything and the human need to find meaning in nature. So passionate necessity is this, you could say, blind force of nature, or perhaps a better term is this obscure force of nature. And then this drive, which is, and here things get difficult, it is also a natural drive if you look at it like this, the drive to find meaning in everything. And I'd like to talk now just about a couple of examples of Goethe showing us this at work, because he really does so quite magnificently. So think of the very, very end of the book. Think of the scene where little Nan and the architect are standing gazing at Ottilia's corpse. And the architect looks at the corpse, he looks at Ottilia, and we read, and it's not certain whether we're reading the thoughts of the architect or the voice of the narrator. That remains open. But what we read is, on page 260, Ottilia's quiet virtues, called forth so recently by nature from her capricious depths, had been wiped out so soon by her indifferent hand. Look at the way nature is described. Capricious depths. Nature is inscrutable, deep, obscure, capricious, but also completely indifferent to human life. Nature creates life, nature wipes life out. And then immediately following this, we have a story, an illustration of the human quest to give meaning to this capricious and indifferent nature. When we read about the doctor talking to Nan. On page 261, we read that the doctor had spent the night in the church, and then he meets Nan, and he finds her natural, calm, and totally self-possessed. She has a clear and accurate memory of everything that had happened, and nothing she said strayed from truth and reality, with the exception of the events at the funeral. which she recounted joyfully over and over, how Ottilia had raised herself up, blessed her, forgiven her, and granted her peace of mind forever. So this is a rational attempt to make sense of Ottilia's death, and it creates a myth. It creates a myth of sainthood. And what's then quite striking is in the penultimate paragraph of the book, the narrator himself, the voice of the narrator then takes this up and speaks of Ottilia as a saint. We read on page 262, one of the last sentences in the book, and since he had passed away, this is Edward, and since he had passed away thinking of his saint, he might rightfully be called blessed. I think there's a small thing that needs improving in this translation, because the original says, und wie in Gedanken an die Heilige eingeschlafen war, so konnte man wohl ihn selig nennen. So the translation says that he passed away thinking of his saint, but the original says he passed away thinking of the saint. In other words, the narrator seems to be buying into this myth that Nan explained on the previous page. The most extreme example of the problem of trying to extract meaning from the world is, of course, Edward, because he's the one who invests most in this process. He's the one who tries desperately to get meaning out of the world, and he's the one who fails every time. And why does he fail? Because his quest for meaning is driven by desire. He only wants one thing, and that's to be together with Ottilia. So every time he sees a sign in the world, he reads it to mean fate wants him to be together with Ottilia. Whereas fate, we know, is completely indifferent. Goethe tells us that, more or less. So we already saw last week, when we talked about the analogy of elective affinities, we saw Edward already interpreting, but interpreting it wrongly. And here his desire is he wants to be together with the captain, and this is how he interprets the analogy. And we can name several prominent examples of Edward interpreting according to his desire and getting it wrong. Early on, we see another example of Edward's drive for meaning, drive for interpretation being clouded by his desire. When Charlotte writes the letter to the captain inviting him to come, and she's so upset about what's going on that she spills ink on the page. And we read, she wrote with fluent and sincere charm, yet with uncharacteristic haste. She smeared the page with an annoying ink blot that only grew larger when she tried to erase it. Edward made a joke of this, and as there was still some room on the page, he added a second postscript to the effect that their friend should take it as a sign of the impatience with which they awaited him, and make as much haste with his journey as they had with writing to him. Now, Edward is clearly speaking of his own desire, not Charlotte's. Then the most extreme example of Edward's drive to interpretation gone wrong is the glass. This glass is drained during the ceremony for laying the foundation stone for the new building, the building that Edward and Ottilia more or less decided where it should go. And we read on page 135 that the young journeyman drained a fine crystal glass at one draught and threw it into the air, for it is a sign of the highest joy to destroy the vessel one has used at such a happy moment. However, some scaffolding has been erected, and someone standing on the scaffolding catches the glass before it can break. And then we read, finally, without letting anyone else hold it, he showed it around, and on it the letters E and O, most delicately intertwined, could be seen engraved. It was one of the glasses that had been made for Edward in his childhood. Later in Book 2, when Mittler comes to visit Edward and tries to talk him out of his singular desire to be together with Ottilia, Edward starts talking about the glass. On page 172, Edward went on, my fate and Ottilia's cannot be separated, and we will not perish. Look at this glass. Our initials are engraved on it. A joyous guest threw it into the air. No one was to drink out of it again. It was to be shattered on the stony ground, but someone caught it. I got it back again at a high price, and now I drink from it every day to convince myself that all friendships forged by fate are indestructible. A friendship forged by fate. This is Edward's interpretation. He sees a force of nature at work here. But at the very end of the novel, something tragic happens. As Edward raised his beloved glass to his lips, he set it down again in horror. It was the same and not the same. He could not see a small mark, he knew. When questioned, the valet was forced to admit that the original glass had recently been broken and replaced by a similar one, also from Edward's childhood. Edward could feel no anger. Reality had sealed his fate. And how could a glass affect him? But it weighed heavily on him. All the same, drink seemed repugnant to him from now on. He appeared to refrain deliberately from eating or participating in conversation, like Ottilia, and then he dies. So Edward's inability to interpret nature, to give it meaning that aligns with his desire, leads directly to his downfall. Because after all, the letters on the glass were not Edward Ottilia, they were Edward Otto. And this brings me to my final point, and that is Otto. When the character of Mittler is introduced, this stark rationalist who believes in the power of the mind to overcome any temptation and to conform to the rules of marriage. When Mittler is introduced, Mittler meaning mediator, when Mr. Mediator is introduced, we read that those who are superstitious about names maintain that the name Mittler, meaning mediator, had obligated him to take on this strangest of all vocations. Now, the little game that Goethe is playing here is that Mittler believes in the rational mind's ability to overcome natural drives, and yet his name seems to have made him the victim of fate. So where does that leave the rational mind? And this is a prefiguration of the game that he's going to play with names when it comes to the main characters. When the elective affinities analogy was introduced, we learned that Charlotte was A, Edward is B, the captain is C, and Ottilia is D. And Edward and Charlotte are bound in this strong bond of marriage. So the experiment of the novel, we've seen this, is what happens when extraneous elements are brought into play, threatening to burst the bonds. So Charlotte is attracted to the captain, Edward attracted to Ottilia. This threatens to erase the bond. We've seen all of this. And now we come to the matter of names. In the very first conversation that takes place between Charlotte, Edward, and the captain, we learn that they both share the name Otto. Edward and the captain agreed that Edward, Otto, should rather take on the name Edward, and Otto was the captain's name anyway. But Goethe takes it even further. Look at the name Charlotte. It contains the word Otto. Look at the name Ottilia. It contains the word Otto. And so Goethe creates this situation where all of the main characters are called Otto or some permutation of Otto. In the plot, he then returns to the analogy of the chemical affinities, and he allows Otto and Otto, or Charlotte and Edward, to enact the most physical of attractions, that is, the act of copulation. However, while performing this act, Charlotte is imagining and desiring the captain, Edward is imagining and desiring Ottilia. Otto and Otte are desiring and imagining Otto and Otti. And so the physiological, the copulation is pulled by desire and imagination more and more away from this chemical bond, to the point where in the natural act of conception a child is born who is called, of course, Otto. Now this child is the result of nature's force in the act of copulation, but also desire's force in the act of imagination, complicated by the fact that desire's force is also nature's force. And as a result of this complex interference of desire and nature, it turns out that Otto, this new life, is a life that cannot be lived. So we've seen how Goethe takes this idea, which was so important and so powerful at his time, that human life is split between the blind force of nature on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the realm of freedom. Blind nature working directly upon bodies, acting as if it were fate and forcing action into a certain direction. Freedom promising the possibility of standing back from nature's determination and being able to apply reason and morality to life. And the place he takes us with this in elective affinity is to the proposition that maybe the split itself is not adequate. Maybe this distinction itself does not do justice to the way nature works in life. Maybe there is only one nature everywhere, and you can look at it in one particular way, and you reach the conclusion that takes you to fate, or you can look at it in another way and see that nature acts as the very freedom that seems to oppose the forces of nature. And this then leaves it up to us whether we want to conceive of a possible resolution of this conflict in terms of the actions of a higher power, perhaps not even in this life, or whether we want to try and develop strategies and techniques for coming to terms with this all-pervasive nature. Bear this in mind when we continue next week with the reading of Wilhelm Meister's Journeyman Years.